What if everything you thought you knew about a royal bloodline was wrong? Not mistaken, not exaggerated, not twisted by tabloids. Wrong. Picture this. A grown man sits alone in a quiet room, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles have gone pale. His breathing is shallow, uneven. On the table in front of him lies a single sheet of paper. Just numbers, letters, scientific jargon. Cold, clinical, indifferent. But to him, it is a death sentence. Not of a body, of an identity. Because this page doesn't just challenge a story, it detonates it. And the most terrifying part? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The palace already knew this question might one day be asked. They just never thought anyone would be brave or reckless enough to answer it. Ask yourself this. If a child's identity threatens an entire institution, who gets protected first? The child or the crown? That question is the heart of this story. And once it's asked, there is no going back. Because bloodlines are not just biology in a monarchy. They are currency. They are legitimacy. They are power. Strip that away, and the palace doesn't crumble slowly. It collapses all at once. This is not a story about science. It's a story about fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of history repeating itself. Fear of a truth that doesn't care about protocol. And it begins with a rumor the palace tried to bury so deep it believed it was dead. A whisper that circulated quietly among courtiers, aides, and former insiders. A whisper that sounded absurd, impossible, offensive, until someone decided to test it. Let's rewind. Long before documents, before sealed envelopes, before whispered phone calls at midnight, there was a child, born into global attention, but raised in confusion. A child whose arrival was celebrated publicly, yet managed privately with extraordinary caution. Medical details vague, timelines blurred, official statements precise, too precise. Have you ever noticed how institutions become overly careful when they're hiding something? Because confidence doesn't over-explain. Fear does. From the beginning, there were small things that didn't quite align. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to unsettle. Hospital procedures that deviated from tradition. Photographs delayed, language softened, and then there were the family dynamics. Tension where there should have been pride, distance where there should have been unity. Have you ever watched people who are all pretending not to notice the same problem? That's what it looked like. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Congratulations that sounded rehearsed. Silence where there should have been warmth. The palace insisted everything was normal. They always do. But behind closed doors, questions began to circulate. Quiet ones at first. Questions that were immediately shut down. Because in this fictional monarchy, there is one rule that outranks all others. Do not ask questions that destabilize succession. Succession is sacred, even when the truth is not. Now imagine being the man officially recognized as the child's father. A man already burdened by legacy, expectation, and comparison. A man who grew up knowing exactly where he stood in the hierarchy. And where he never would. He loved the child. That much was real. Fiercely. Protectively. But love doesn't silence doubt forever. Especially when doubt is fed by silence. Especially when doors close a little too quickly when you walk down palace corridors. Especially when conversations stop the moment you enter the room. Have you ever felt like the subject of a secret you were never meant to hear? That's how it began. Not with accusation. With isolation. And isolation is how institutions break people. Slowly. Quietly. Politely. Until one day, something snaps. In this story, that moment comes not with shouting, but with paperwork. A routine request. A simple form. A hypothetical question posed to the wrong person. What if we confirmed ancestry for archival purposes? What if we preserved genetic records for history? What if? The request triggered a reaction far stronger than anyone expected. Lawyers appeared. Meetings multiplied. Files were locked. And suddenly, a man who had never questioned his role began to wonder why everyone else was so afraid he might. That fear became the loudest voice in the room. Because innocent truths do not require this much protection. Let me ask you something. If you were told repeatedly not to look somewhere, wouldn't that become the first place you'd want to look? That's human nature. And that's where this story turns dangerous. Because curiosity, once ignited, cannot be unlit. The test, the one no one was supposed to authorize, didn't happen in a palace lab. It happened quietly, privately, through intermediaries who understood discretion better than loyalty. No trumpets, no announcements, just a sample, a comparison, and a result. When the results came back, they didn't scream. They whispered. But what they whispered was enough to bring a man to his knees. Because the numbers did not point where they were supposed to. They pointed sideways, upwards, backwards, toward a figure whose name alone could destabilize decades of damage control. A man already wrapped in scandal, already protected and punished in equal measure, already known as the palace's most carefully managed liability. In this fictional world, he was the one name no one wanted connected to a child's future. And yet, there it was. Probability percentages don't care about reputation. DNA doesn't care about titles. It only answers one question. Who? The room went silent. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that could be said would change history. Imagine the weight of that moment. If the results stayed secret, a man would live a lie. If it came out, a child would be weaponized by the media. And if the palace intervened, as it always does, it would confirm exactly what it wanted to deny. That something had been hidden, and hidden badly. Now ask yourself this. If you were the institution, what would you do? Protect the truth? Or protect the structure that survives by controlling it? This is where the story stops being about family and becomes about power. Because once DNA enters the conversation, every smile becomes suspect. Every past decision gets reinterpreted. Every silence becomes evidence. And the people involved begin to realize something terrifying. This wasn't a single secret. It was a system of secrets, built over years, protected by protocol, justified by the greater good. But the greater good for whom? Certainly not the child. Certainly not the man holding that piece of paper with shaking hands. And certainly not the public, who have been told for generations that monarchy is built on continuity, honor, and blood. In this fictional tale, the real tragedy is not betrayal. It's realization. The realization that the truth was never meant to survive. And that once revealed, it would not just embarrass the palace. It would expose how easily reality bends when legacy is on the line. As the man stares at the document, one thought eclipses all others. Not anger, not jealousy, loss. Because even if this truth never sees daylight, something has already died. Certainty. And once certainty is gone, nothing feels stable again. He knows the palace will respond. He knows calls will come. He knows pressure will be applied, softly at first, then harder. But before any of that happens, there is one final moment. A moment where he is alone with the truth. And he asks himself a question no one prepared him for. If the child is not mine by blood, what am I by role? That question doesn't have a comforting answer. And somewhere else, in another wing, another building, another carefully guarded space, other people are realizing the same thing. The test didn't just reveal a father. It revealed a fault line. And once a fault line is exposed, every step becomes dangerous. Because the ground beneath the palace is no longer solid. It's waiting. Waiting for the next move. Waiting for the next leak. Waiting for the moment when silence is no longer possible. And as the man folds the paper, stands up, and walks toward a future he never agreed to, one thing becomes clear. The truth is no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. The reaction to it is. But what came next would change everything, and no one inside the palace saw it coming. Have you ever noticed that the most powerful buildings are also the quietest? Not because nothing happens inside them, but because everything that happens is meant to be controlled. That's the first thing you need to understand about the palace in this story. It doesn't panic loudly. It doesn't argue publicly. It doesn't react the way normal families do. It absorbs shocks. It contains fallout. It rewrites narratives before the public even knows one exists. And the moment that piece of paper changed hands, the palace went into a mode most people never see. Containment. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. No alarms. No running aids. Just doors closing. Calendars filling. And people who hadn't spoken in years suddenly finding reasons to reconnect. Because when a secret threatens succession, protocol becomes a weapon. Let's pick up exactly where we left off. The man with the paper doesn't storm out. He doesn't shout. He doesn't call the press. He does something far more dangerous. He goes quiet. And in this world, silence is never empty. It's strategic. Within hours, the palace knows something is wrong. Not because anyone confessed, but because behavior changed. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. A scheduled appearance was suddenly under review. Small things. But palaces are built to notice small things, especially when those small things disrupt decades of pattern recognition. Inside a private office lined with portraits of ancestors who never imagined DNA kits, a senior aide stares at a screen. They're not reading the result. They're reading the absence of denial. Because when a rumor is false, it gets crushed immediately. When it's true, it gets managed. Let me ask you something. If you were innocent, wouldn't you want to shut the rumor down instantly? That's what the palace has always done. But this time, there is hesitation. And hesitation is how you know fear has entered the room. Phones begin to ring, but not outward, inward. Legal teams, medical consultants, historians. Yes, historians. Because this isn't just about what happened. It's about what has happened before, and what people might remember if they're reminded. The palace has lived through scandals, affairs, cover-ups, illegitimate rumors. It survived them all by doing one thing exceptionally well: creating doubt. Because when truth can't be erased, it can be drowned. Drowned in noise, in alternatives, in sources say. But DNA doesn't argue. It doesn't leak selectively. It either matches or it doesn't. And that's the problem. Inside another room, another conversation is happening. A woman who has served the institution longer than most marriages last sits across from a younger advisor. He's nervous. She's calm. Because she's seen this before. Not this exact scenario, but this pattern. A secret surfaces. Someone panics. The palace responds. She asks one question. Who authorized the test? The answer is unclear. And that makes everything worse. Because if it wasn't authorized officially, then it happened unofficially. Which means there are intermediaries. Which means there are loose ends. Loose ends are unacceptable. In this story, there is an unspoken hierarchy of threats. Tabloids are manageable. Public opinion is malleable. Social media is chaotic but short-lived. But documents? Documents last. They get scanned, copied, forwarded. And once they exist outside the palace's control, they become immortal. That's why the first move isn't denial. It's delay. Time is the palace's favorite ally. With enough time, outrage fades. With enough time, narratives shift. With enough time, people get tired. So the instruction goes out quietly. Do nothing. Say nothing. Let the silence speak first. Meanwhile, something else happens. The man with the paper is not alone in his silence. Someone else knows. Someone who was never supposed to. And that person is terrified. Because unlike the man who feels betrayed, this person feels exposed. They've lived their entire life as a managed risk. Protected, but never trusted. Included, but never centered. In this fictional world, they've always known one truth. If the palace ever had to choose between them and stability, they would lose. Every time. So when whispers reach them, whispers that a question has been asked, their first reaction isn't anger. It's dread. Because they understand optics. And they understand scapegoats. Have you noticed how institutions always need one person to absorb blame? Not because they're guilty, but because someone must be. Inside a private residence far from cameras, this person stares at their own reflection. Older than they feel. Tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. They know the palace's rules. Rule 1, never confirm. Rule 2, never deny unless forced. Rule 3, if exposed, retreat behind procedure. But DNA doesn't respect procedure. It jumps straight to conclusions. And that terrifies everyone involved. Back at the palace, a decision is made. Not about truth. About leverage. If the man with the paper feels alone, he's unpredictable. If he feels supported, he's manageable. So outreach begins. Not confrontational. Compassionate. Concerned. Are you all right? We noticed you seemed overwhelmed. This must be a lot to process. Notice what they don't say. They don't say, it's false. They don't say, you're wrong. They say, this must be difficult. Because acknowledging difficulty doesn't acknowledge accuracy. And that's intentional. The palace is very good at validating emotions without validating facts. It's how they survive. But the man isn't naive. He's grown up inside this machine. He knows the language. And he knows that concern is a substitute for answers. So he does something unexpected. He asks for clarity. Not loudly. Not publicly. Privately. And that request sends a ripple through rooms he's never been allowed into. Because clarity is dangerous. Clarity removes wiggle room. Clarity demands response. And the palace hates being cornered. Meetings are scheduled, then rescheduled, then reframed. This is no longer about a document. It's about risk assessment. What happens if this gets out? Who leaks first? Who looks worse? Who can be protected? And who cannot? These are not moral questions. They are strategic ones. Somewhere deep in the building, a file is pulled. An old one. So old most people forgot it existed. Medical notes. Travel records. Dates. Not to confirm anything, but to see how exposed they already are. Because the worst secrets aren't the ones you discover. They're the ones that leave trails. And trails lead to patterns. Patterns lead to conclusions. And conclusions don't need official confirmation to become accepted truth. Outside the palace, nothing seems different. The world spins. News cycles move on. But behind those walls, tension is building. Not explosive tension. Pressure cooker tension. The kind that makes people slip. The kind that turns allies into liabilities. And then something unexpected happens. Someone breaks protocol, not dramatically, subtly. They ask the wrong question in the wrong room. And that question confirms what everyone feared. This is bigger than one family. It's bigger than one child. It threatens the story the palace has been telling itself for generations. That blood equals legitimacy. That lineage equals destiny. And if that story cracks, everything built on it starts to wobble. As the chapter closes, one thing becomes painfully clear. The palace is not preparing to tell the truth. It's preparing to survive it. And survival, in this institution, has always come at a cost. The only question now is, who's going to pay it? Because the next move won't come from the man holding the paper. It will come from someone who has nothing left to lose. And when that happens, silence will no longer be an option. What if the most dangerous person in a scandal isn't the one at the center of it? What if it's the one everyone assumed was already dealt with? Because in this story, the next crack doesn't come from the grieving man with the paper. It comes from the man the palace stopped watching. For years, he existed in a strange limbo. Not fully inside, not fully exiled. A living reminder of how close scandal can come to the throne without quite touching it. The palace had learned how to manage him. Appearances limited, movements monitored, relevance reduced. In public, he was treated like a problem that had already been solved. In private, he was treated like a problem that could never be fully erased. And that distinction matters. Because people you think are finished stop pretending. They stop playing roles. They stop protecting narratives. They start remembering things they were told to forget. When the first whisper reaches him, not officially, not directly, he doesn't react immediately. He listens. That's the thing about people who've survived scandal. They don't jump at rumors. They weigh them. And this one feels different. Not sensational. Not exaggerated. Careful. Careful rumors are the ones that come from inside. He hears that questions are being asked. That documents exist. That someone crossed a line no one thought could be crossed. DNA. That word alone changes the temperature in the room. Because DNA is final. You can deny memory. You can discredit witnesses. You can bury paperwork. But DNA? DNA doesn't forget. And suddenly, the man who was supposed to be irrelevant realizes something unsettling. This secret doesn't just threaten the palace. It threatens him. Because if the truth points in his direction, even in a fictional sense, he knows exactly how this ends. Not with justice. With containment. Let me ask you something. If an institution had to choose between preserving its image and protecting one individual with a long history of controversy, which do you think they'd choose? He already knows the answer. That's why his reaction isn't panic. It's calculation. He thinks back. Not emotionally. Chronologically. Dates. Places. Moments he was told didn't matter. You'd be surprised how many unimportant details resurface when stakes change. A visit explained away as courtesy. A meeting framed as coincidence. A silence that lasted just a little too long. At the time, none of it seemed consequential. Now it feels like a map. And he understands something the palace doesn't. The man with the paper is still thinking like a father. The palace is thinking like an institution. But he's thinking like someone who knows how these stories end. With someone being offered up. So he does what the palace never expects. He prepares. Quietly. He doesn't call lawyers. He doesn't issue statements. He doesn't reach out to the man at the center of the storm. Instead, he reaches backward. To people who were there before the palace cleaned house. Former aides. Retired security. Medical staff who signed confidentiality agreements decades ago and assumed they'd never matter again. People who have nothing left to lose. Have you noticed how the most dangerous witnesses are? And sometimes they protect the truth, not out of virtue, but out of spite. Now here's where it gets complicated. The man doesn't want exposure. Exposure would destroy him. But silence? Silence would destroy him anyway. So he considers a third option. Leverage. If he knows something the palace fears, he can use it to shield himself. Not by threatening to speak, but by making it clear he could. Subtle signals. Reminders. Conversations that end just a second too late. Have you ever watched someone communicate without actually saying anything? That's what he does. And the palace understands immediately. Because institutions are fluent in implication. They've been speaking it for centuries. Suddenly, the narrative shifts again. This is no longer about protecting a child. It's about preventing a chain reaction. If this man feels cornered, he could destabilize everything. Not by confessing, by forcing the palace to act. And that action, whatever it is, would be seen as confirmation. Let me ask you something else. Why do you think institutions hate being rushed? Because rushed decisions reveal priorities. And priorities reveal truths. Back with the man holding the paper, another realization dawns. He's no longer being reassured. He's being managed. The tone has changed. Less empathy, more structure. Which tells him one thing. The palace believes the danger has shifted. And that means someone else is now considered the greater risk. He wonders who, and whether that person knows it yet. As all of this unfolds, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. This story isn't moving forward because someone wants it to. It's moving forward because too many people are now afraid of different outcomes. Fear fractures unity. Fear creates mistakes. And fear is spreading. The palace, for the first time, is reacting instead of controlling. And reactions always leave traces. As the chapter draws to a close, the man everyone underestimated makes a decision. Not to speak, not to confess, but to stop protecting a system that never protected him. He decides that if the truth ever comes out, it won't be on the palace's terms. And somewhere, in a room where silence used to feel safe, someone realizes too late. They've lost control of who holds the next move. Because the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones you hide. They're the ones shared by people who no longer care what happens next. And what comes after this decision won't just test loyalty. It will force the palace to choose between sacrifice and exposure. And that choice? It's coming faster than anyone expected. What if the most dangerous evidence in this story isn't the result itself, but the fact that it exists at all? Because once something exists, it can be copied. Once it's copied, it can be shared. And once it's shared, it can never be unknown. That's the nightmare now haunting the palace. Not headlines. Not outrage. Existence. Let's rewind to the moment everyone swore would never happen. The test. The one no press release announced. The one no protocol authorized. The one that slipped through the cracks because institutions, for all their power, still rely on people. And people make decisions. This test didn't begin as rebellion. It began as justification. A quiet reassurance. A way to silence doubt. A means to prove what everyone was supposed to accept without question. That's the irony. The test wasn't ordered because someone believed the rumor. It was ordered because someone wanted to kill it. Have you ever noticed how efforts to disprove something often end up confirming it instead? The process was wrapped in neutrality. No palace seals. No official channels. Just a private clinic. A discreet intermediary. Language chosen carefully. Archival verification. Medical completeness. Future-proofing. Words that sound harmless. But behind those words was panic. Because the palace has learned something over centuries. Rumors don't die when ignored. They die when replaced. And facts are the most effective replacements. Unless the facts are inconvenient. The intermediary understood discretion better than loyalty. They didn't ask why. They didn't want to know. They understood one thing. If powerful people are willing to bypass protocol, something is already wrong. Samples were collected. Quietly. No drama. No confrontation. No one was supposed to feel threatened. And that's what makes what happened next so devastating. Because when the results came back, they didn't simply fail to reassure. They redirected the entire story. Instead of closing a door, they opened another. One the palace had welded shut years ago. The scientist who reviewed the data didn't know the context. That was intentional. They saw numbers. probabilities, patterns. And those patterns didn't align with the official narrative. Not slightly, significantly. In science, there is a phrase that makes people uneasy. Statistically improbable. It doesn't mean impossible. It means unlikely enough to demand explanation. And explanation is exactly what no one wanted. The intermediary froze. Not because they understood the implications fully, but because they recognized the tone shift. This wasn't good news. Good news is delivered confidently. This was delivered cautiously. And caution is contagious. The document was sealed, encrypted, shared with exactly one person. The man whose certainty had already begun to erode. Now imagine that moment. You're not looking for betrayal. You're looking for confirmation. And instead, you're handed ambiguity so precise it feels intentional. The numbers don't accuse. They imply. An implication is worse. Because implication invites interpretation. Interpretation invites debate. Debate invites exposure. The man rereads the document. Once, twice, 10 times. Not searching for error. Searching for relief. But relief doesn't come. Only realization. This doesn't make sense. Which means something else must. That's when the palace should have intervened. But they didn't. Because they didn't know yet. And that delay? That delay is everything. Inside the palace, another meeting takes place. Not about results. About possibility. What if a test exists? What if someone already crossed the line? What if this rumor can no longer be dismissed as baseless? Because once a test exists, denial becomes risky. Denying something that can be proven false later is manageable. Denying something that might be proven true? That's fatal. So the palace faces an unfamiliar problem. They don't know what the truth is. And for the first time, they can't control it. Have you ever watched an institution hesitate? It looks calm from the outside. Inside, it's chaos disguised as deliberation. Committees form. Language is debated. Scenarios are mapped. Not outcomes. Reactions. Because the palace doesn't plan for truth. It plans for response. And responses depend on timing. Who speaks first? Who leaks? Who gets blamed? The test becomes the gravitational center of every conversation. Even among people who haven't seen it. Especially among people who haven't seen it. Because imagination fills gaps faster than facts. Meanwhile, the intermediary realizes something terrifying. They are now a liability. They know too much. And in institutions like this one, knowing too much shortens careers. Sometimes reputations. Sometimes worse. They consider destroying the file. But destruction leaves absence. And absence raises suspicion. They consider handing it over. But to whom? There is no neutral party here. Every option has consequences. So they do what frightened people often do. They delay. And delay allows the story to grow. The man with the paper begins asking questions. Not aggressively. Methodically. And each answer he receives is incomplete. Which tells him everything. If the test were meaningless, it would be dismissed. If it were wrong, it would be corrected. But it's being avoided. Avoidance is confirmation's quiet cousin. Let me ask you something. If a system truly believed a result was false, wouldn't it want to prove that immediately? Silence only makes sense when proof might not go your way. As days pass, the palace becomes aware of the test's existence. Not officially, through implication. A request phrased incorrectly. A meeting called unnecessarily. A reference that shouldn't exist. And suddenly, the fear crystallizes. This isn't rumor anymore. This is evidence adjacent. And evidence adjacent stories are the hardest to kill. Because you can't disprove what you can't see. But you also can't dismiss what clearly exists somewhere. The palace issues internal instructions. No one confirms anything. No one denies anything. Everyone sticks to script. But scripts crack under pressure. And pressure is mounting. Because the intermediary has gone silent. Because the man with the paper is no longer asking questions. Because the man no one was supposed to notice is making quiet moves of his own. Free silences. Free threats. And the palace realizes too late. They are reacting to 3 different crises at once. Which means they are controlling none of them. The test, that single document, now exists in too many minds. Even if destroyed, its impact would remain. Because the idea of it has already escaped. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful secrets are the ones people believe exist, even if they never see them? That's what this has become. A shadow document. One that dictates behavior without ever being acknowledged. And shadows are dangerous. They distort everything around them. As the chapter closes, one final decision is made. Not to reveal the test, not to deny it, but to neutralize the people connected to it. Because institutions don't attack facts. They attack messengers. And someone, somewhere, has just been identified as expendable. The only problem? They don't know it yet. And when they find out, they won't go quietly. Because the test was never meant to exist. But now that it does, it's already rewriting the rules. And what comes next won't be about science. It will be about survival. What happens when silence stops being protection and starts becoming a threat? Because in this story, silence has always been the palace's first instinct. Say nothing. Acknowledge nothing. Let time do the erasing. But this time, time isn't erasing anything. It's sharpening it. The problem with silence is that it creates space. And space gets filled with speculation, with fear, with people connecting dots they were never meant to see. Inside the palace, the mood shifts from controlled to brittle. Not outwardly, never outwardly, but internally, something fundamental has changed. People stop speaking freely, not because they're told not to, because they don't know who might be listening. Meetings grow shorter, emails grow vaguer, decisions get delayed. And that's how you know an institution is scared. Because confidence moves quickly, fear hesitates. The man with the paper feels it first, not through words, through access. A door that used to be open now requires clearance. A meeting that was routine becomes under review. A call that would have been returned in minutes goes unanswered for hours. Have you ever noticed how power doesn't announce itself when it's withdrawing? It just recedes. And when it recedes, it leaves you exposed. He realizes something then. This isn't about reassurance anymore. This is about containment. And containment always has an endpoint. You are either inside it, or you are sealed off. That realization hardens something in him. Up until now, he's been trying to understand, trying to process, trying to preserve some version of stability. But institutions don't reward patience. They exploit it. So he changes tactics. He stops asking questions. He stops seeking clarity. He does the one thing the palace can't anticipate. He waits. Because waiting, when done deliberately, is its own form of pressure. While the palace debates strategy, he observes. Who checks in? Who avoids him? Who suddenly sounds rehearsed? Patterns emerge quickly when you stop interrupting them. And one pattern is unmistakable. The palace isn't trying to convince him the test is meaningless. They're trying to convince him to forget it exists. That tells him everything. Meanwhile, the intermediary realizes they're being frozen out. Not fired. Not confronted. Just excluded. Access revoked. Schedules altered. Invitations rescinded. Soft punishment. The kind that doesn't leave fingerprints. Have you ever been erased without being told you were? That's what it feels like. And erasure creates panic. Because panic creates mistakes. The intermediary starts reaching out. Carefully. To the wrong people. And the palace notices. Because surveillance isn't always technological. Sometimes it's social. When someone who was once invisible starts acting nervous, they stand out. A file is flagged. Not the test itself. The communications around it. Who spoke to whom? Who hesitated? Who changed behavior? And that's when the palace makes a critical miscalculation. They assume fear equals compliance. They assume isolation equals control. They forget something essential. People who feel cornered don't protect systems. They protect exits. At the same time, the man no one was supposed to notice senses movement. He's been here before. Different scandal. Same rhythm. First comes silence. Then comes distancing. Then comes the offer. Not overt. Subtle. A suggestion framed as concern. An understanding. That cooperation will be remembered. Have you ever been offered mercy before guilt was established? That's what this feels like. And that's when he knows. They're preparing a narrative. And he's in it. But not as a beneficiary. As a boundary. Someone the palace can point to and say, this is where the problem ends. That realization doesn't make him angry. It makes him precise. Because anger is messy. Precision is dangerous. He starts documenting. Not the scandal. The response. Who says what? When they say it. What they avoid saying. Because in institutions like this, reaction is the confession. Back inside the palace, arguments intensify. Not about truth. About timing. Do we wait? Do we intervene? Do we apply pressure now or later? Every option carries risk. But doing nothing is no longer neutral. Because the outside world is restless. Journalists haven't broken anything yet. But they're circling. You can feel it when they are. Questions get sharper. Language gets specific. Old articles get resurfaced. Not accusations. Context. And context is the enemy of silence. The palace releases nothing, but that absence becomes its own headline. Why isn't anyone saying anything? Why does no one look surprised? Why does everyone look prepared? The man with the paper watches it unfold, and he feels something unexpected, not vindication, resolve. Because if the palace wanted him quiet, they would have reassured him. They didn't. They isolated him, which means they believe he's a variable. And variables, in systems like this, get neutralized, unless they act first. Let me ask you something. If you knew an institution was preparing to manage you out of relevance, wouldn't you want to control the narrative before they do? That question lingers. He doesn't answer it yet, but he stops protecting the silence. He stops deflecting questions. He doesn't confirm anything, but he doesn't deny anything either. And that subtle shift changes everything. Because denial kills stories. Ambiguity feeds them. The palace notices immediately. They try to course correct. A meeting is offered. A tone shift. Sudden warmth. Sudden availability. But it's too late. Because warmth after distance feels manipulative, and manipulation confirms fear. The intermediary, now fully aware they're expendable, makes a choice. Not a dramatic one. A practical one. They create a copy. Not to release. Just to have. Insurance. Have you ever noticed how power teaches people to think in backups? That copy becomes the most dangerous object in the room. Not because of what it proves, but because of what it represents. Loss of monopoly. Back channels activate. Not leaks. Feelers. Who would be sympathetic? Who might listen? Who has reason to distrust the palace? And that's when the story crosses a line it can't uncross. Because once third parties become aware that something exists, the palace no longer controls who cares. As the chapter draws to a close, one final silence settles. Not imposed. Chosen. 3 people. 3 secrets. 3 different fears. All waiting for someone else to move first. But stalemates don't last forever. Because pressure demands release. And when it comes, it never comes from the direction you expect. Somewhere, a message is drafted. Not sent. Yet. But the moment it is, silence will stop being a shield and become a confession. And when that happens, the palace will realize too late. It wasn't protecting stability. It was delaying collapse. What if the most dangerous leak isn't the one that explodes across headlines, but the one that slips quietly into the bloodstream of public conversation? Because that's how this one begins. Not with a front-page scandal. Not with a breaking news banner. But with a question. A question that appears in the wrong place at the wrong time and refuses to disappear. It starts innocently enough. A journalist asks a palace spokesperson something oddly specific during an unrelated briefing. Not accusatory. Not dramatic. Just curious. The spokesperson blinks. Not long. Just long enough. And that blink does more damage than any accusation ever could. Have you ever noticed how people don't remember answers as clearly as they remember reactions? That blink becomes a ripple. The journalist doesn't write a story. Not yet. Instead, they call someone. A former editor. A fixer. Someone who understands how rumors evolve into narratives. And the response they get back is chilling. You're not the first person to ask that. That's how the palace realizes control has slipped. Not because something has been published, but because something has been shared. Quietly. Selectively. Deliberately. This isn't a leak in the traditional sense. There's no document circulating. No screenshot. No source close to the situation, whispering specifics. What's circulating is awareness. And awareness is impossible to contain. Let's be clear. No one has proof. But enough people now believe proof exists. And belief changes behavior. Editors greenlight exploratory research. Producers dust off old footage. Legal teams start asking questions they hadn't planned to ask. Not because they know the truth, but because they smell vulnerability. And vulnerability is news. Inside the palace, panic finally surfaces, not emotionally, but procedurally. Crisis cells are activated. Not officially. Unofficially. Meetings without minutes. Calls without records. Decisions made verbally. Because documentation is dangerous now. Documentation implies acknowledgement. And acknowledgement implies liability. The palace doesn't ask, is the story true? They ask, can the story survive without us confirming it? That question tells you everything. Meanwhile, the man with the paper realizes something terrifying. The story is moving without him. He's no longer at the center. He's become context, and context can be twisted. He hears the question secondhand, from someone who thinks they're helping. Did you hear what people are asking? He doesn't answer. Because. And yet, the world is reacting, which means someone else has moved, or multiple people. And that's the worst-case scenario, because one leak can be managed. Many whispers cannot. The story mutates. In private conversations, it grows more dramatic. In professional spaces, it becomes cautious and clinical. People don't say what they think happened. They say what they think might have happened. And might is a powerful word. Might invites speculation. Speculation invites research. Research invites exposure. Have you ever watched a story assemble itself without anyone directing it? That's what this is now. A self-propelling narrative. The palace releases a vague statement. Not about the story. About privacy. About protecting children. About the dangers of speculation. It's meant to calm. Instead, it confirms. Because if nothing were happening, there would be nothing to protect. The statement doesn't mention DNA, but everyone reads it as if it does. The man with the paper feels the shift immediately. Friends stop asking how he's doing. They start asking if he's okay. Different question, different implication. And suddenly, he understands something painful. He's lost control of how his silence is interpreted. Silence used to be dignity. Now it's suspicion. He considers speaking, not to confirm, not to deny, just to reclaim narrative. But the palace moves first. A meeting is scheduled. Urgent. Closed door. The tone is no longer warm. It's firm. The message is clear without being stated. If you speak, we respond. And response will not be kind. Have you ever been warned without being threatened? That's the art the palace has perfected. At the same time, journalists push harder. Not for answers, for reactions. They watch body language. They compare statements. They line up timelines. And someone notices something no one expected. A discrepancy. Not in dates. In emphasis. Certain details are being defended too aggressively, which suggests those details matter. A veteran reporter says it aloud. Not on air. In a newsroom. They're overprotecting something. And once that sentence is spoken, it can't be unheard. The palace tries to clamp down. But clamps only work when you know what you're clamping. This leak has no single source. It's the product of fear, curiosity, and silence colliding. As the chapter nears its end, one final development occurs. A question appears in print, not as an accusation, as a hypothetical. What would happen if a royal lineage were ever questioned by modern science? No names, no claims, just theory. But theory framed by context is still dangerous, because everyone knows what it's referring to. And once mainstream outlets start asking hypotheticals, the palace's strategy collapses. Because you can't sue a question, you can't silence curiosity, and you can't control what people think when you refuse to explain. The man no one was supposed to notice reads the article. And for the first time, he smiles. Not because he wants chaos, but because he knows the palace has lost something precious. Control of tempo. From now on, they will be reacting. And institutions that react make mistakes. The man with the paper reads it too. And he realizes something that changes his posture completely. This is no longer about whether the truth comes out. It's about how much damage is done before it does. And that means the next move matters more than ever. Because the leak no one could trace has done its job. It's destabilized silence. And once silence is destabilized, someone will fill it. The only question left is who, and whether they speak to save themselves, or to burn everything down. Because the next chapter won't be quiet. It will be decisive. What happens when an institution that survives on tradition is forced to improvise? Because improvisation is where mistakes live. And this meeting, the one that takes place behind doors so thick they were designed to outlast centuries, is not part of any protocol. It exists because protocol has failed. The room is familiar, yet different. Same table, same portraits, same polished surface reflecting carefully neutral expressions. But the people sitting around it feel something they rarely acknowledge. Uncertainty. The meeting isn't announced. It doesn't appear on any official schedule. It's framed as a check-in. But everyone in the room knows what it really is. A reckoning. The man with the paper is invited, not summoned. That distinction matters. Invitations suggest choice. Summons suggest authority. The palace needs him cooperative, not defiant. At least for now. He arrives calm. Too calm. Which immediately unsettles the room. Have you ever noticed how confidence unnerves people who rely on leverage? They expect agitation. They expect emotion. They don't expect composure. He sits. He listens. He says very little. And that, more than anything else, throws the balance off. Because this meeting was meant to guide him. Instead, it exposes the palace. They open with concern. This must be difficult. We want to support you. There's been a lot of speculation. Speculation. That word again. He lets it hang. Then he asks one question. What exactly are people speculating about? Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Because everyone in the room understands the trap. To answer is to define. To define is to confirm. So someone responds vaguely. Unhelpful narratives. Irresponsible curiosity. Still no denial. Still no reassurance. Just disapproval of the conversation itself. And that's when he realizes something crucial. They don't know how to close this. Which means they don't know how to control it. He leans forward. Not aggressively. Deliberately. He asks another question. If there's nothing to address, why are we here? That lands harder than any accusation. Because the answer is obvious. They're here because something exists. And existence is enough. The palace representatives shift. Language tightens. The conversation moves from emotional framing to institutional framing. Privacy, duty, stability, the child's well-being. Have you ever noticed how often institutions invoke children when they want silence? Not because they're wrong, but because they're effective. He doesn't argue. He doesn't object. He agrees. Yes, the child must be protected. Yes, speculation is harmful. Yes, stability matters. And then he adds one sentence that changes the air in the room, which is why clarity matters more than silence. No one responds immediately, because clarity is exactly what they don't want. Clarity ends flexibility, and flexibility is the palace's oxygen. Someone finally speaks. Carefully, clarifying things could inflame matters. This is delicate. Delicate, another word that means delay. He nods, then asks something no one expected. Is there a reason clarity would be damaging? The question isn't hostile. It's surgical, and the room knows it. Because now, if they say yes, they admit vulnerability. If they say no, they invite transparency. Either answer weakens them. The man no one was supposed to notice isn't in the room, but his presence is felt. Because every calculation now includes him. What if he speaks? What if he leaks? What if he reacts to how this meeting is handled? The palace realizes it's no longer dealing with one variable. It's dealing with several. And they don't align. The meeting shifts again. This time, it becomes about coordination. About ensuring everyone presents a united front. About avoiding mixed messaging. That phrase is code. It means, don't contradict us. The man with the paper listens. Then says something quietly devastating. Unity requires shared understanding. The room freezes. Because shared understanding requires shared facts. And facts are exactly what no one wants to discuss. The palace offers reassurances without substance, support without definition, promises without timelines. And slowly, something becomes clear. This meeting isn't about resolution. It's about compliance. They want him to stop waiting. They want him to stop being ambiguous. They want him to commit to silence. But silence now has a price. And he knows it. So he doesn't agree. He doesn't refuse. He does something far more unsettling. He asks for time. Time to process. Time to reflect. Time to decide what's best. That answer is polite. But it terrifies them. Because time in his hands is different from time in theirs. Time for him means possibility. Time for the palace means loss of momentum. And momentum is already slipping. The meeting ends without resolution. That's rare. Most palace meetings end with alignment. This one ends with distance. As he leaves, one person says something meant to sound reassuring. We'll handle this. He stops, turns, and says something that will echo through the building for weeks. Who is we? That question doesn't get answered. Because no one in the room is sure anymore. Outside the meeting room, messages are already being drafted. Not statements. Contingencies. What if he speaks? What if he leaks? What if someone else does first? And that's when the palace understands something deeply uncomfortable. They are no longer controlling the narrative. They are competing with it. Meanwhile, the man no one was supposed to notice hears about the meeting. Not details. Tone. And tone tells him everything. They're scrambling, which means they're vulnerable. And vulnerability invites leverage. He doesn't act yet, but he prepares. Because preparation is the only power left to him. The intermediary hears too, and they make a decision of their own. Not to leak. Not yet. But to make sure they are not alone when the time comes. They reach out to someone unexpected. Someone with credibility. Someone with nothing to gain from scandal. And that's when the story takes another turn. Because once credibility enters the picture, hypotheticals become investigations. The man with the paper goes home that night and sits alone. The meeting replays in his mind. Not what was said, what wasn't. And he realizes something that makes his chest tighten. The palace isn't planning to tell the truth. It's planning to outlast it. And that means the burden of decision is shifting from institution to individual. Let me ask you something. If you were handed a truth that could destabilize an entire system, would you protect yourself? Or would you protect the system that failed you? That's the question he's now living with. And as the night deepens, one thing becomes clear. The rules that govern this story no longer apply. The palace has broken them by improvising. And once the rules are broken, anyone can rewrite them. The next move won't come from a meeting room. It will come from someone who decides they've waited long enough. And when that happens, there will be no room left for silence. What if the person who changes everything isn't driven by anger, ambition, or revenge, but by discomfort? Because discomfort is quieter than rage. Less visible, but far more persistent. This chapter doesn't begin in the palace. It begins in a place the palace underestimates. A place where loyalty is looser, but conscience is sharper. A place where people aren't trained to protect symbols, only truth. The intermediary sits across from someone they never expected to involve. Not a journalist, not a lawyer, not a rival, a professional, respected, measured, uninterested in drama. Someone whose credibility isn't built on access, but restraint. The kind of person institutions assume will stay neutral. That assumption will prove costly. The intermediary doesn't start with the scandal. They start with doubt, with discomfort, with a question phrased carefully enough not to sound like an accusation. If you suspected something serious was being mishandled, what would you do? The answer doesn't come immediately, because the person across from them understands implications. They don't rush. They listen. And listening is dangerous. Because once you listen, you're involved. The intermediary explains just enough. Not the details. The pattern. Silence where clarity should exist. Pressure where reassurance should be. Fear where confidence should live. The professional leans back. Not because they're skeptical, but because they're calculating. Institutions rarely panic without reason. And when they do, the reason is usually buried beneath layers of process. Have you ever noticed how often wrongdoing hides behind procedure? That's when the professional asks the question that matters. Is there documentation? The intermediary hesitates, then nods. Not proof, but proximity. Enough to raise serious concern. The professional doesn't ask to see it. Not yet. Because seeing something creates obligation. And obligation changes everything. Instead, they say something that shifts the trajectory of the entire story. If this is real, silence isn't neutral. It's participation. That sentence hangs in the air. Because it reframes the entire dilemma. Up until now, everyone involved has been deciding between action and inaction. Between speaking and staying quiet. But this reframes silence as a choice. And choices carry responsibility. The intermediary leaves that meeting shaken, not relieved, because now they're not alone. And being not alone is both comforting and terrifying, because it means someone else is thinking, assessing, preparing. Meanwhile, inside the palace, assumptions are being made. They assume the intermediary is contained. They assume the man with the paper is conflicted. They assume the man no one was supposed to notice is bluffing. And most dangerously, they assume outsiders will behave predictably. That assumption is about to collapse. The professional begins doing something subtle, not investigating, contextualizing. They review public records, statements, timelines, not searching for confirmation, searching for consistency. And what they find is troubling, not because there's a smoking gun, but because there are too many carefully worded gaps. Gaps that align too neatly, gaps that feel intentional. Have you ever noticed how lies don't just contradict facts? They leave fingerprints in language, over-explanation, vagueness, sudden emphasis on irrelevant details. The professional notices all of it, and they don't like what it suggests. They reach out to one other person, then another, quietly, discreetly, not asking for secrets, asking for impressions. and something unsettling happens. The impressions align. Different people, different roles, same unease. That's when the professional realizes this isn't a rumor. It's a suppressed conversation. And suppressed conversations have a way of resurfacing. Meanwhile, the man with the paper senses the shift before anyone tells him. He receives a message. Indirect, neutral, but unmistakably different in tone. Someone has asked questions. Not the usual kind. The careful kind. And suddenly, he understands something crucial. The story is no longer about him. It's about accountability, which means the palace's leverage is weakening. Because accountability doesn't negotiate. It documents. It records. It persists. Inside the palace, new intelligence filters in. Not specifics. Signals. Someone outside is paying attention. Someone credible. Someone not easily discredited. And that sends a jolt through the system. Because institutions can survive tabloids, they struggle against integrity. Emergency discussions resume. This time, not about messaging. About exposure. Who knows what? How much? And how soon? They realize something too late. They spent too much time managing people inside the system. They ignored the ones outside it. The man no one was supposed to notice hears about the professional. Not by name, by description. And he reacts differently than expected. Not with fear, with relief. Because credibility changes the equation. Credibility means this won't end with him as a scapegoat. It means the palace can't simply sacrifice a familiar villain. And that gives him room. Room to wait. Room to observe. Room to prepare his own narrative. Because if this story breaks, he intends to survive it. The intermediary feels the pressure intensify. Subtle warnings. Renewed attention. A sense that they are being watched again. But now, the fear is different. Because fear shared is fear diluted. And fear diluted turns into resolve. The professional makes a decision. Not to publish. Not to accuse. But to document. Quietly. Methodically. They begin assembling a record. Of reactions. Of statements. Of inconsistencies. Because if the truth ever surfaces, it will need context. And context is the difference between scandal and reckoning. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that shock, but the ones that make denial impossible? That's what this is becoming. Not a revelation. A process. The palace senses the change, and they make their next move. Not publicly. Privately. They attempt to neutralize the professional. Not through pressure. Through reassurance. A friendly outreach. A reminder of norms. An appeal to discretion. But the professional sees it for what it is. Preemptive containment. And that confirms everything. Because institutions don't contain nothing. They contain threats. As the chapter moves toward its end, lines are quietly drawn. Not between people. Between principles. Those who believe silence preserves stability. And those who believe silence corrodes it. The man with the paper feels the weight of choice pressing harder. Because now, if he stays quiet, he's not just protecting himself. He's complicit. And that realization changes him. He begins preparing something of his own. Not a statement. A record. Just in case. The intermediary secures their copy. The professional secures theirs. 3 versions of the same unease. All waiting. Because the ally no one expected has entered the story. And once allies form, outcomes change. The palace still believes it can outlast this. But it has misunderstood something fundamental. This is no longer about speed. It's about inevitability. And inevitability doesn't care about protocol. It only waits for the moment when enough people decide. They've waited long enough. And when that moment arrives, everything hidden will demand to be seen. What happens when denial stops working? Not publicly, not loudly, internally. Because denial doesn't fail all at once. It erodes. And by the time anyone notices, the damage is already done. Inside the palace, something subtle but irreversible has shifted. People stop asking whether the story can be contained. They start asking how much damage control will be required when it isn't. That change in language matters. Because institutions reveal their fears through phrasing long before they reveal them through action. The emergency discussions continue, but the tone is different now. Sharper, shorter, less theoretical. This is no longer about if. It's about when. And more importantly, who controls the moment. Have you ever noticed how powerful systems don't collapse from attack? They collapse from timing. The palace understands that if this story breaks at the wrong moment, it could destabilize everything they've worked to preserve. Succession narratives. Public trust. The illusion of continuity. And illusions are fragile, especially when exposed to facts, or even the possibility of facts. The professional ally's quiet presence has forced a recalculation. Not